Before the truck door opened, Aiko Tanaka had already decided how she would survive the next 5 minutes. Do not resist, do not cry, and never look an American soldier in the eyes. That was what they had been told again and again during the long weeks of transport across the Pacific. The Americans were supposed to be unpredictable, ruthless, men who saw surrender as weakness and prisoners as objects. The women had repeated those warnings to each other every night like a ritual, whispering them in the dark while the ocean rolled beneath the steel hull. Now the truck jolted to a stop on a dusty road somewhere in the Philippines, and the heat pressed down like a physical weight, easily 90 degrees under a white sky that seemed too bright to look at. The engine died with a rough cough. For a moment no one moved. Inside the truck bed, 12 Japanese women sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes fixed on the floorboards. Aiko could hear her own breathing, shallow and controlled. Outside, boots moved across gravel. American voices, low, casual, almost bored. That surprised her. She had imagined shouting. Orders barked like thunder. Instead, the voices sounded ordinary, the way farmers might speak to each other across a field. The metal latch snapped open. Sunlight poured into the truck bed so suddenly that several women flinched. Aiko felt her stomach tighten. This was the moment she had prepared for. Any second now someone would grab her arm, pull her forward, push her down from the truck. She kept her eyes lowered, waiting for the impact of a hand. It never came. Instead, a calm voice spoke in slow English. Step down, one at a time. The words meant little to her, but the tone carried no anger. Aiko hesitated. No one touched her. No one forced her forward. After a few seconds, another sound followed. A boot shifting in the dirt, then a gesture she could sense more than see. When she finally glanced up, just for a fraction of a second, she saw a young American soldier standing several feet away, leaving a clear space between himself and the truck. His rifle hung loose on its strap. His posture was relaxed, almost careful, as if he were deliberately keeping his distance. The woman beside Aiko climbed down first. She stepped onto the ground slowly, her legs unsteady after hours of travel. The soldier did not reach for her. He simply stepped back another foot and pointed toward an open area of shade beneath a canvas awning. One by one the women climbed down from the truck, each expecting the same thing Aiko had expected, the sudden grip, the rough pull, the loss of control. Each time, nothing happened. The Americans stood back. They spoke quietly. They indicated directions with open hands instead of touching anyone. Aiko's turn came last. The metal step was almost 2 feet from the ground. Her legs trembled as she climbed down. For an instant she lost her balance and felt herself tipping forward. Her body braced for the inevitable hand catching her arm. Again, nothing. The soldier moved slightly, ready if she fell, but he stopped himself just short of contact, allowing her to steady herself alone. Aiko landed on the dirt and straightened slowly. The air smelled of dry grass and engine oil. She dared another quick glance at the soldier. His name patch read Thomas Reed. He was watching the group with a calm expression, not hostile, not mocking, simply attentive. That was when the first crack appeared in the story Aiko had believed for years. The Americans had complete control of the situation. They had rifles, authority, and 12 exhausted prisoners standing in the open sun. Yet the most shocking thing about that moment was not what they did. It was what they refused to do. The women stood beneath the canvas awning in a quiet line, 12 figures in faded uniforms, their shadows stretched thin across the packed dirt as the afternoon sun drifted west. Aiko Tanaka kept her eyes lowered again, though now it was no longer only fear that guided the movement. It was confusion. The air carried the dry scent of grass baked under tropical heat, somewhere close to 95 degrees, and the distant hum of generators from the American camp. She could hear the low murmur of soldiers speaking to one another, not about the prisoners, but about ordinary things. One man mentioned coffee. Another asked about the time. The casual rhythm of their voices felt unreal. In the world Aiko had been taught to expect, enemies did not speak so calmly near prisoners. A wooden table had been set beneath the shade, and a clipboard rested on its surface beside a stack of folded blankets. Sergeant Daniel Brooks stepped forward, a tall man with sunburned cheeks and a voice that carried easily without shouting. He read names slowly from a list, careful with each syllable. When he reached a name, he would pause, then gesture gently toward the table. No one was pulled forward. No one was rushed. The women approached one at a time, their movements cautious, as though the ground itself might betray them. Aiko watched the first woman step forward. Her name was Keiko Sato, a schoolteacher from Osaka who had not spoken more than a few words during the entire journey. Keiko stopped 3 feet from the table and bowed slightly out of habit. Sergeant Brooks returned a small nod, almost awkward, then placed a blanket on the table and stepped back so she could take it herself. Again, the same strange rule held firm. Distance. Deliberate and unwavering. The Americans did not cross it. Aiko felt her heartbeat slow and then quicken again for a different reason. She had expected humiliation. She had prepared herself for shame as something inevitable, something that would arrive as surely as the tropical sun each morning. Instead, there was this quiet choreography unfolding in front of her, a pattern she could not yet understand. The soldier named Thomas Reed stood a few yards away near a row of wooden supply crates, watching the process with a steady calm that made him seem older than he likely was. He could not have been more than 24 or 25. His uniform sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and a thin line of dust marked where his watch had rested against his wrist. Every time one of the women approached the table, he shifted slightly to the side, giving them more space rather than less. It was such a small gesture that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who was not studying him closely. But Aiko noticed. She noticed everything now. When the 5th name was called, something unexpected happened. One of the older women, Mrs. Nakamura, swayed slightly as she stepped forward. The long hours in the truck and the oppressive heat had drained what little strength she had left. Aiko saw the moment when the world tilted for her. The woman's knees softened and her shoulders dipped as if gravity had suddenly grown stronger. Several soldiers saw it too. Instinct moved across their faces. For a split second, Thomas Reed leaned forward, his body ready to catch her. Then he stopped himself. His hand hovered in the air for the briefest moment before he lowered it again. Instead, he turned his head and called out clearly across the yard. Nurse Hayes. The name carried through the warm air. Within seconds, a woman in a pale medical uniform approached at a quick but controlled pace, a canvas bag swinging lightly at her side. She moved straight toward Mrs. Nakamura and gently steadied her, speaking in a voice so calm it sounded almost like a conversation between neighbors. Aiko watched the entire moment unfold with growing disbelief. The soldier had been close enough to help. He had been strong enough to lift the woman easily. Yet he had chosen not to touch her. Instead, he had stepped back and called someone else. The pattern held. The invisible line remained unbroken. Aiko felt the strange crack inside her widen just a little more. The shade beneath the canvas awning felt cooler now, though the air still carried the heavy warmth of the late afternoon, somewhere close to 90 degrees as the sun slowly lowered behind the line of palm trees at the edge of the camp. Aiko Tanaka stood quietly with the others, the folded blanket now resting in her hands, its rough wool texture unfamiliar after the long weeks of travel. The simple object felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because it had been given without force. She could not stop thinking about that detail. Across the yard, Nurse Eleanor Hayes guided Mrs. Nakamura to a wooden bench positioned near a water container. Her movements were careful, patient, never hurried. She poured water into a small metal cup and held it out with both hands. Mrs. Nakamura accepted it slowly, her fingers trembling as she lifted the cup to her lips. Aiko noticed something else then. The nurse spoke softly the entire time, her voice calm and steady even though the older woman could not understand the words. It sounded less like instruction and more like reassurance. Around them, the American soldiers continued their routine with quiet efficiency. A truck engine started somewhere beyond the supply sheds. A hammer struck metal twice in the distance. Someone laughed briefly, near the motor pool before the sound faded into the warm air. Nothing about the scene matched the world Aiko had prepared herself for. Her mind kept searching for the hidden moment when everything would change. Perhaps the kindness was temporary. Perhaps it existed only while officers were watching. She had heard stories about such things before. Displays meant to confuse prisoners. But the longer she stood there, the harder it became to believe that explanation. The soldiers did not seem to be performing. They barely looked at the women at all, unless necessary. Their attention drifted naturally between their duties, their conversations, the quiet rhythm of work inside the camp. It felt strangely ordinary. Sergeant Daniel Brooks continued calling names from the clipboard, his voice steady and measured. Each woman stepped forward when her name was spoken, collected her blanket or canteen from the table, and returned to the line. The pattern never broke. The Americans always stepped back first, always allowed space. Aiko noticed Thomas Reed again as he moved toward a stack of wooden crates, lifting one carefully and carrying it to a shaded area near the barracks. His movements were unhurried, precise, as if every action followed a quiet rule he had already accepted long ago. When he returned across the yard, he paused briefly near the water container where Mrs. Nakamura now sat resting. For a moment Aiko thought he might finally approach the bench. Instead he stopped several feet away and asked Nurse Hayes something in a low voice. The nurse nodded and answered with a short sentence that sounded reassuring. Thomas Reed listened, then simply gave a small nod before walking back toward the supply area. Again the same invisible boundary held firm. It was not hesitation. It was intention. Aiko felt a strange tension growing inside her chest. Something different from fear, yet just as powerful. The belief she had carried across the ocean had once felt solid, like stone walls protecting her from uncertainty. Now those walls were beginning to shift. Small cracks had appeared during the first moments after stepping off the truck. With every quiet gesture she witnessed, those cracks widened a little more. The sun moved lower behind the trees, and the shadows across the yard stretched longer across the dust. Somewhere nearby a bugle sounded from another section of the camp, its notes drifting through the warm air in a slow, steady call. Aiko realized suddenly that no one had raised their voice at the prisoners. No one had hurried them. No one had treated them like objects to be managed. The Americans had every advantage. They had the camp, the weapons, the authority of victory. Yet they behaved as though restraint mattered more than control. That idea unsettled her in a way she had not expected. Because if the stories she had been told about the Americans were wrong, then something much larger might also be wrong. And that possibility was far more frightening than the fear she had carried before. The bugle call faded slowly into the warm evening air, leaving behind a silence that felt deeper than before. Aiko Tanaka stood with the blanket folded carefully against her chest, listening to the distant sounds of the camp shifting toward its evening routine. Somewhere beyond the supply sheds a truck rolled past on gravel, its tires crunching softly before disappearing behind a row of wooden barracks. The sun had dropped lower now, casting long amber light across the dusty yard. Shadows stretched across the ground like dark ribbons, and the temperature began to soften slightly from the harsh 90-degree heat that had pressed against them earlier in the afternoon. Sergeant Daniel Brooks closed the clipboard and spoke briefly with another soldier near the table. Aiko did not understand the words, but the tone sounded calm, almost routine, as if the arrival of prisoners was only another task in a long day of work. Walk steadily. Thomas Reed moved along the edge of the path, not beside them, but a few feet away, maintaining the same quiet distance he had held since the moment they stepped off the truck. His boots pressed shallow marks into the dust as he walked. Once, when the path narrowed between two storage crates, he stepped off the trail entirely to give the group more room to pass. Again, the same deliberate restraint appeared in the smallest movement. The women noticed it too. Aiko could see the subtle changes in their posture. Shoulders that had been tightly drawn now eased slightly. Heads lifted a little higher. No one spoke, but the tension that had filled the truck earlier that day had begun to loosen in small, careful breaths. At the end of the path stood a long wooden barracks with screened windows and a wide front step. The door stood open, allowing warm air to move through the interior. Nurse Eleanor Hayes walked ahead and stepped inside first. After a moment she returned to the doorway and gestured for the women to enter. Aiko hesitated for a fraction of a second, then climbed the two wooden steps. The interior smelled faintly of clean wood and fresh canvas. Rows of simple bunks lined the walls, each with a folded blanket and a small metal cup placed neatly beside it. Soft evening light filtered through the screens, casting narrow patterns across the wooden floor. It was quiet inside, the kind of quiet that belongs to places meant for rest rather than control. The women moved slowly between the bunks, unsure at first whether they were allowed to choose. Sunlight. All her life, she had believed that power always showed itself through force. That was the rule she had been taught without question. Yet everything she had seen since arriving here followed a different rule entirely. The Americans had power, but they used it with restraint so careful it almost felt invisible. And the more she thought about that restraint, the more it unsettled her. Because if the enemy she feared behaved this way, then the story she had believed for years might not simply be incomplete. It might have been wrong from the very beginning. Evening settled gently over the camp as the last light of the sun faded behind the palm trees, and the temperature slowly dropped toward the low 80s, bringing with it a faint breeze that moved through the screened windows of the barracks. The constant awareness of guards standing too close, watching too carefully, reminding the prisoners of their power. Instead, the soldiers had disappeared from the doorway almost immediately after the women entered the building. Outside in the yard, lanterns flickered to life along the pathways between the barracks. Their soft yellow glow spread across the ground, illuminating the gravel roads and wooden steps without harshness. From her place, near the window, Aiko could see figures moving through the light, soldiers walking between buildings as they finished their evening tasks. Among them, she recognized the tall shape of Thomas Reed crossing the yard with another soldier. They carried a wooden crate together toward one of the supply sheds. When they reached the door, Reed stepped aside so his partner could enter first, holding the door open with a quiet patience that seemed to guide many of his actions. It was another small detail, almost invisible unless someone was paying close attention. Aiko realized she had begun watching the Americans the way a student watches a teacher, searching for hidden meaning behind ordinary gestures. What she saw only deepened the quiet confusion inside her. Very still after that moment, her eyes returning to the lantern light flickering across the yard. Something about the brief encounter unsettled her more than anything else that had happened that day. Not because it was frightening, but because it was simple. The soldier had every reason to enter the barracks if he wished. He had the authority to inspect the room, to question the prisoners, to remind them of the power he represented. Instead, he had remained outside, careful not to cross the threshold without invitation. Aiko exhaled slowly, realizing that the invisible boundary she had noticed all afternoon was still there, even now in the quiet hours of evening. And the longer it remained unbroken, the more impossible it became to ignore the truth quietly forming in her mind. The night deepened slowly over the camp, and the sky beyond the screened windows turned from deep blue to a darker shade that held the first faint stars above the palm trees. Inside the barracks, the air cooled just enough to feel comfortable, settling somewhere near 78 degrees as the evening breeze drifted through the wooden structure. Aiko Tanaka remained awake on her bunk long after most of the other women had grown quiet. The thin mattress beneath her felt unfamiliar but steady, and the blanket resting across her lap carried the clean, simple scent of wool and sun. Around her, the room had settled into the quiet rhythm of exhausted travelers finally resting after a long journey. Soft breathing filled the spaces between the bunks. Somewhere near the far wall, one of the women shifted gently in her sleep. Aiko leaned slightly toward the window, watching the lantern light moving across the yard outside. The camp had not fallen silent the way she had expected. Instead, it continued breathing in a calm, steady pattern. Footsteps passed occasionally along the gravel path. A distant radio murmured quietly from another building, its faint music drifting across the warm night air before fading again. The soldiers seemed to move through the darkness without urgency, as if the entire place functioned on a quiet agreement rather than strict tension. Aiko listened carefully for something else, something that might confirm the fears she had carried for so long. She waited for raised voices, for harsh commands, for the sound of boots approaching the barracks door with the intention of entering uninvited. Minutes passed, then an hour. None of those things happened. Outside, the lantern nearest the barracks flickered gently as insects circled the light. Aiko watched the shape of a guard pass through the glow, walking along the fence line at the edge of the compound. He paused briefly near the corner post, checking the wire and the gate latch with a simple glance before continuing on his path. The movement looked routine, practiced, almost relaxed. She realized with quiet surprise that the soldiers guarding the camp did not stare constantly at the prisoners. They did not linger outside the barracks or pace back and forth in restless circles. They simply completed their patrols and moved on. The realization created a strange sensation in Aiko's chest, something close to relief but not quite the same. Relief suggested the absence of danger. What she was feeling instead came from the presence of restraint. The Americans behaved as if certain boundaries were obvious to them, rules that did not need to be explained aloud because everyone understood them already. That thought unsettled her more deeply than the harsh discipline she had imagined. Because restraint required choice. And choice meant the soldiers were deciding, moment by moment, how they would use the authority they possessed. Aiko turned slightly on the bunk and rested her head against the wooden wall, her eyes still following the quiet movement outside. For years she had believed that victory gave people permission to act without limits. That belief had been repeated in speeches, in newspapers, in every story told about the enemies across the ocean. Yet everything she had seen since stepping off the truck suggested a different rule entirely. The Americans did not behave as though victory freed them from restraint. They behaved as though victory demanded it. Outside the barracks, the lantern light shifted again as another figure crossed the yard. This time Aiko recognized the tall shape immediately. Thomas Reed moved along the gravel path carrying a small metal bucket, his steps unhurried as he walked toward the water container near the supply shed. He filled the bucket slowly, then placed it beside the porch steps before turning back toward the center of the camp. The gesture seemed ordinary at first, but Aiko realized after a moment that the bucket had been placed there for the women inside the barracks. No one had asked for it. No announcement had been made. The soldier had simply noticed the need and answered it without stepping inside the building. Aiko closed her eyes briefly, feeling the quiet weight of that realization settle into her thoughts. Every expectation she had once trusted was slowly dissolving into uncertainty. And in the stillness of the warm tropical night, she began to understand that the most powerful thing she had witnessed since arriving at the camp was not kindness spoken aloud. It was discipline practiced in silence. Morning arrived slowly over the camp, the first light of dawn spreading across the sky in pale shades of gray and gold as the tropical air warmed again toward the mid-70s. Aiko Tanaka opened her eyes before the bugle sounded, her sleep lighter than it had been in months, but deeper than she had expected on her first night inside the barracks. For a moment, she did not move. She simply listened. Outside, the screened window birds had begun their morning calls in the trees beyond the fence, sharp and lively sounds that cut through the quiet air. Somewhere across the compound, a metal pot clanged softly against another as soldiers prepared the morning routine. The camp was waking in the same steady rhythm it had carried through the night, without urgency and without tension. Aiko sat up slowly on the bunk and looked around the room. The other women were beginning to stir as well. Some blinked toward the pale light entering through the screens, while others stretched their tired shoulders after the long journey. The thin mattresses creaked quietly as people shifted their weight. No one spoke at first. They simply looked around the room, as if confirming that the calm of the previous evening had not been a dream. Through the window, Aiko noticed movement near the porch steps. The small metal bucket she had seen Thomas Reed place there during the night still rested beside the railing, now filled with fresh water that reflected the soft colors of the sunrise. One of the women stepped outside carefully and returned with the bucket, setting it near the door so everyone could use it to wash their faces. Again, the gesture carried no announcement, no explanation, only quiet usefulness. Aiko stood and walked toward the window. The air drifting through the screen felt cooler than the day before, perhaps 74 degrees as the sun climbed slowly above the horizon. Across the yard, soldiers were already moving between the buildings, beginning their morning tasks. Some carried wooden crates. Others walked toward the motor pool where trucks waited in neat rows. The same calm pattern appeared again. No one rushed. No one shouted. The camp seemed to function like a small town beginning another ordinary day. Aiko watched closely for Thomas Reed and soon spotted him near the supply shed, lifting a stack of folded canvas tarps with another soldier. When he finished, he walked toward the barracks path and paused briefly near the porch. He did not enter. Instead, he placed a small wooden crate beside the steps and stepped back several feet before turning away. Curious, Aiko moved toward the doorway with two other women. Inside the crate were simple breakfast rations, bread, several small tins, and a metal kettle still warm from the kitchen. The food had been left without ceremony, as if the soldiers believed the prisoners should take what they needed without being watched. Aiko looked out across the yard again and saw Reed already halfway back toward the supply building, his attention focused on another task. He had not waited to see the women discover the crate. He had not lingered for thanks. The realization settled into Aiko's thoughts with quiet clarity. The restraint she had noticed yesterday had not disappeared with the coming of a new day. It continued naturally, as if it were part of the structure of the camp itself. Aiko picked up one of the pieces of bread and held it in her hands, feeling the warmth still trapped inside the crust. For years she had believed that enemies acted from cruelty because cruelty was easy. Yet everything she had seen here suggested the opposite. Discipline required effort. It required attention. It required people who believed that power carried responsibility even when no one was watching. As the sun rose higher and the light filled the barracks with soft gold, Aiko understood that the quiet boundaries she had witnessed since arriving were not temporary gestures meant to impress prisoners. They were habits, and habits were far more difficult to fake than kindness offered only once. The morning continued unfolding across the camp with the steady calm of a place that had already learned its own rhythm. By the time the sun climbed higher above the palm trees, the temperature had warmed toward the low 80s, and the yard outside the barracks filled with quiet activity. Aiko Tanaka stood near the open doorway holding the empty metal cup she had used for breakfast, watching the slow movement of the American camp as if it were a scene from another world. The women had eaten the bread and the small portions of food from the wooden crate without being interrupted. No soldier had returned to supervise them. No one had counted the pieces or washed their hands. The trust in that simple absence of oversight unsettled Aiko almost as much as the restraint she had witnessed the day before. Around her the other women were speaking in low voices now, the first real conversation since arriving. The tone carried confusion more than relief. Keiko Sato whispered that perhaps the Americans were behaving carefully because officers might appear at any moment. Another woman suggested that the kindness would fade after the first few days. Aiko listened quietly without offering an opinion. She did not know the answer either, but something inside her felt increasingly certain that what she was seeing was not temporary. Outside the barracks, a small group of soldiers moved along the path carrying wooden crates toward the motor pool. Their boots pressed light marks into the dust, leaving a pattern that the breeze erased slowly behind them. Among them, Aiko recognized Thomas Reed again. He walked near the end of the group, balancing a crate against his shoulder while speaking with another soldier about something that made both of them smile briefly. The conversation sounded ordinary, like two men discussing work rather than guarding prisoners from an enemy nation. When they reached the motor pool, the crates were set down in a neat row beside one of the trucks. Reed brushed the dust from his hands and glanced once toward the barracks building. The distance between him and the prisoners remained exactly as it had been since the first moment Aiko stepped off the truck. A few yards. Enough space for choice to remain visible. Aiko realized suddenly that the distance itself was a kind of language. It said something without words. It said that the soldiers knew exactly how much power they possessed, and that they had decided not to use it carelessly. The thought lingered in her mind as she stepped outside onto the porch. The wooden boards beneath her sandals felt warm already as the sun strengthened across the yard. She walked down the 2 steps slowly and carried the metal cup toward the water container near the fence. No one stopped her. No one shouted instructions. A soldier passed by on the path and simply nodded once in quiet acknowledgement before continuing on his way. Aiko filled the cup and watched the water ripple inside the metal surface. The reflection of the sky shimmered across it for a moment before settling again. She lifted the cup and drank slowly, the cool water easing the dryness in her throat. When she finished, she placed the cup back beside the container and looked across the compound once more. The camp moved around her in the same calm rhythm as before, trucks starting, tools being carried, men walking between buildings with the relaxed focus of people who knew their responsibilities. And once again the invisible line remained in place, clear and unbroken. The soldiers did not cross into the space where the prisoners stood unless it was necessary. They spoke when needed. They stepped back when the moment passed. Aiko stood quietly in the sunlight and felt the final pieces of her certainty shift inside her thoughts. The enemy she had feared was not behaving like the enemy she had been taught to expect. And the longer she watched, the more she realized that the Americans were not trying to prove anything to the prisoners. They were simply behaving the way they believed people should behave when they held power over others. That understanding settled over her slowly, like the warmth of the rising sun spreading across the quiet camp. The sun continued its slow climb above the camp, and by late morning the air had warmed toward the upper 80s, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and engine oil drifting from the motor pool. Aiko Tanaka stood near the water container again, this time with more steadiness in her posture than she had shown when she first stepped off the truck the day before. The camp no longer felt like an unknown place filled with hidden danger. It felt structured, almost predictable, the way a well-organized town might function during a busy workday. Trucks rolled slowly along the gravel paths. Soldiers carried supplies between buildings. The sound of distant tools, tapping against metal, echoed lightly through the warm air. None of the movements carried urgency or tension. Everything unfolded with quiet discipline. Aiko noticed how the prisoners themselves had begun to move differently as well. The women no longer kept their eyes fixed on the ground with every step. Their shoulders were still cautious, but the rigid fear that had filled their movements during the first hours had softened. Keiko Sato walked across the yard toward the laundry line where several buckets had been placed earlier that morning. She paused briefly as a soldier approached along the same path. For a moment, the two figures simply adjusted their steps, each giving the other room to pass without touching. The soldier offered a small nod before continuing toward the storage sheds. Keiko returned the nod instinctively before she realized what she had done. The moment lasted only a second, yet Aiko felt its significance clearly. Respect had been exchanged without a single word spoken. Aiko turned her attention back toward the supply area where Thomas Reed was working beside another soldier stacking wooden crates in the back of a truck. The vehicle's engine idled quietly, the low rumble blending with the steady sounds of the camp. Reed lifted each crate with careful efficiency, placing them in neat rows as if the arrangement mattered just as much as the work itself. When the final crate was secured, he stepped down from the truck bed and wiped his hands against the cloth tucked into his belt. The other soldier said something that made Reed glance toward the barracks again. For a brief moment his eyes scanned the yard where the prisoners stood. There was no suspicion in the glance. It looked more like a simple habit, the way someone checks a doorway while leaving a room. Aiko found herself wondering what he saw when he looked toward them. Did he see enemies from across the ocean? Did he see strangers who had once believed terrible things about him? Or did he simply see people who happened to be standing inside the same patch of sunlight? The thought lingered with surprising weight. Because the more Aiko watched the Americans move through their work, the more she realized that none of them behaved as if the prisoners were objects of curiosity or hatred. The soldiers treated the women as part of the environment of the camp, no different from the trucks or the supply sheds or the lantern posts that lined the paths. That absence of hostility created a strange quiet space where fear had once lived. Near the barracks porch, Nurse Eleanor Hayes appeared again carrying a small basket filled with folded cloths. She placed the basket beside the steps and gestured toward the women so they could take what they needed. Her voice remained gentle even though most of the prisoners could not understand the words she spoke. The gesture alone was enough. Aiko stepped forward and took one of the cloths, feeling the soft cotton between her fingers. She dipped it briefly into the water container and wiped the dust from her hands. The coolness of the cloth against her skin felt refreshing under the growing heat of the day. When she looked up again, she saw Thomas Reed walking across the yard toward the barracks path. For a moment their eyes met once more across the open space. This time Aiko did not look away immediately. Instead, she held the moment for a second longer than before. Reed offered the same quiet nod he had given the previous evening. Nothing more, nothing less. Then he continued walking past the barracks without slowing, leaving the same respectful distance between himself and the prisoners. As he disappeared toward the next row of buildings, Aiko realized something that unsettled her more deeply than any fear she had carried across the ocean. The Americans were not trying to change the prisoners' minds. They were simply living by a set of rules that made cruelty unnecessary. And the longer those rules remained visible, the harder it became for Aiko to hold on to the stories she had once believed without question. By midday the sun stood high above the camp and the temperature climbed close to 90 degrees, pressing warm light across the wooden barracks and the dusty paths that connected each corner of the compound. Aiko Tanaka stood beneath the narrow shade of the barracks porch, watching the slow movement of the American soldiers as they continued their work. The morning had unfolded without interruption, each hour following the same quiet rhythm she had begun to recognize. Trucks arrived and departed from the motor pool. Crates were moved from storage to loading docks. The camp did not feel tense or hostile. It felt organized, almost peaceful in a way that still seemed difficult for her mind to accept. Nearby, several of the women from the barracks were rinsing their cups at the water container while speaking quietly among themselves. Their voices carried a different tone now, softer and less guarded than they had been when the truck first arrived. Keiko Sato stood beside Aiko for a moment, her eyes scanning the yard with the same careful curiosity. She whispered that she still expected something to change, that perhaps the soldiers were simply waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. Aiko listened, but did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained focused on the supply area across the yard where Thomas Reed and another soldier were adjusting the ropes that secured cargo in the back of a truck. The work required patience. Reed checked each knot carefully, tightening them one at a time before stepping back to examine the entire row again. It was the same attention she had noticed in every action he took. Nothing rushed, nothing careless. When the ropes were finished, he stepped down from the truck bed and walked a short distance toward the shade of a storage building where a metal canteen hung from a nail in the wall. He drank from it slowly, then replaced it before returning to the truck without lingering. Aiko watched the movement with a strange sense of focus. It was not the man himself that held her attention, but the pattern behind his actions. Every step he took seemed guided by an invisible rule she could not yet fully understand. A short time later, Sergeant Daniel Brooks crossed the yard toward the barracks carrying another clipboard. When he reached the porch, he stopped several feet away and spoke calmly in slow English, gesturing toward the open space beside the building. Though the women understood only fragments of his words, the meaning was clear enough. The prisoners would help with small tasks around the camp. Simple work. Nothing heavy. Nothing forced. Brooks waited patiently while Nurse Eleanor Hayes repeated the instructions using a few gestures and simple phrases she had learned. The women exchanged uncertain glances but gradually stepped forward to listen. Aiko noticed again that Brooks never closed the distance between himself and the group. He remained several feet away the entire time, speaking with the same measured tone he had used the previous day. The space between them remained untouched, almost respected like a boundary everyone agreed not to cross. When the explanation ended, Brooks pointed towards several nearby areas of the camp where help was needed. Some women would assist with laundry lines. Others would help organize supplies near the kitchen building. The instructions were simple and clear. No one was ordered or pushed into motion. The choice was left to the group to begin moving on their own. Aiko found herself stepping forward almost automatically when Nurse Hayes gestured toward the storage shed near the motor pool. She and two other women walked slowly across the yard, their footsteps quiet against the warm dust. As they approached the shed, Aiko saw Thomas Reed again, standing beside a row of wooden crates. He noticed the women approaching and immediately stepped aside, giving them space to reach the supplies stacked near the door. The gesture was so natural it felt almost practiced. Reed gave a small nod of greeting but said nothing, allowing the women to begin sorting the lighter bundles without interruption. For several minutes, they worked quietly in the shade of the shed, arranging folded cloth and small packages into neat stacks. Reed continued his own work a few feet away, lifting heavier crates and placing them inside the truck bed. Not once did he step closer than necessary. Not once did he treat the women as though they required supervision. The invisible boundary remained present even during the shared work. As Aiko finished placing the final bundle onto the shelf, she paused for a moment and looked across the yard again. The camp moved around her with calm purpose. Each person focused on their task without suspicion or hostility. In that moment, she realized something that had been slowly forming in her thoughts since the first step off the truck. The Americans were not behaving kindly because they felt sympathy for prisoners. They were behaving this way because they believed restraint was simply the correct way to act. And the quiet certainty behind that belief made it impossible for her to pretend any longer that the stories she had carried across the ocean were still true. The afternoon sun leaned westward, and the light across the camp softened into a pale gold that stretched long shadows between the barracks and the supply sheds. The temperature had begun to fall, slightly from the midday heat, settling somewhere near 85 degrees, and a quiet breeze moved through the open spaces of the compound. Aiko Tanaka worked beside the storage shelves inside the shade of the supply shed, arranging folded cloth bundles into neat rows the way she had seen the soldiers organize their crates earlier. The task was simple, almost calming, because it required attention but not worry. Around her the camp continued its steady rhythm. Engines started and stopped in the distance. Boots moved along gravel paths. Voices carried across the yard in calm conversation that rose and faded like the sound of wind passing through tall grass. Aiko noticed that the women working beside her had begun moving with more confidence as well. Keiko Sato sorted several small boxes of utensils, while another woman carried empty sacks toward a wooden rack along the wall. No one hurried them. No one checked their work with suspicion. The soldiers nearby simply continued with their own duties, occasionally glancing toward the women only to ensure the path between the crates remained clear. Thomas Reed was still working near the truck parked outside the shed. He lifted another crate into place and adjusted the rope securing the load with the same careful attention he had shown throughout the morning. When he finished, he stepped back from the truck and studied the arrangement briefly, then nodded once to himself before wiping his hands on the cloth tucked at his belt. Aiko watched him for a moment longer than necessary, noticing again how his movements carried the same quiet discipline she had seen since the first moment they met. He did not hover near the prisoners. He did not watch them constantly. He simply worked within the same shared space as if the invisible line between them was understood by both sides. A short time later, Reed walked toward the water container near the fence line, filling a small metal canteen before returning across the yard. As he passed the open door of the shed, he paused just long enough to speak a few words to the soldier beside him. The tone sounded casual, almost friendly, though Aiko could not understand the meaning. The conversation ended with a quiet laugh before the two men returned to their work. That small moment lingered in Aiko's thoughts. She had expected the Americans to treat prisoners with cold hostility or constant suspicion. Instead, the soldiers behaved as though the presence of prisoners was simply another part of the day, no more extraordinary than the crates stacked beside the truck or the lanterns hanging from the barracks posts. Aiko finished arranging the final cloth bundle on the shelf and stepped outside into the warm afternoon light. The yard stretched before her in calm order, trucks aligned neatly along the motor pool and supply crates arranged beside the sheds. Across the compound, a bugle sounded again, its notes drifting through the air with a clear, steady tone that seemed to mark the passing of another hour. Reed looked up briefly at the sound before turning toward the barracks path. As he crossed the yard, his eyes met Aiko's once more. This time the moment lasted slightly longer than before. Neither of them spoke. Neither moved closer. Reed simply lifted his hand in a small gesture of acknowledgement before continuing on his path toward the next row of buildings. Aiko remained standing in the sunlight for several seconds after he had gone, the warm breeze moving lightly through her hair. Something inside her had shifted again, though she struggled to name it clearly. The fear she had carried across the ocean had not vanished all at once. It had dissolved slowly, piece by piece. Each time the soldiers chose restraint over force, distance over control, discipline over anger. And now, standing quietly in the fading afternoon light, Aiko understood that the change was no longer only happening around her. It was happening inside her as well. The enemy she had expected to meet no longer existed in the form she had imagined. What remained instead was a truth she had never been taught to consider. That power did not always reveal itself through domination. Sometimes it revealed itself through the quiet decision not to use it at all. Late afternoon slowly gave way to evening as the sun lowered behind the palm trees beyond the fence line and the air cooled toward the high 70s. The long shadows of the barracks stretched across the dusty yard, turning the camp into a quiet pattern of gold and soft brown light. Aiko Tanaka stood near the porch steps once again, watching the final movements of the workday settle into calm order. The small tasks assigned to the prisoners had ended without ceremony. The folded cloth bundles were stacked neatly in the storage shed. The laundry line swayed gently with the last warm breeze of the day. Soldiers finished securing equipment around the motor pool, while others carried lanterns to the posts that lined the main paths between the buildings. The camp felt different now compared to the moment when the truck had first arrived. At that time, every movement had been sharp with tension, every sound magnified by fear. Now the same sounds carried a quieter meaning. Boots on gravel. Tools being placed carefully into wooden boxes. Low voices speaking across the yard as men finished the final work before nightfall. Aiko noticed that several of the women from the barracks had begun to sit together on the porch steps, speaking softly in Japanese about the strange calm of the place. Some of them still doubted what they were seeing. One insisted that the soldiers must eventually reveal a harsher side once the novelty of the prisoners faded. Another wondered if the Americans behaved this way because they believed it would weaken the enemy's spirit. Aiko listened from a short distance without interrupting. She understood their uncertainty because she had carried the same doubts only hours earlier. Yet each quiet moment inside the camp continued to push her thoughts in a different direction. Across the yard, Thomas Reed finished closing the rear gate of the truck he had been loading all afternoon. He checked the latch twice before stepping back to examine the vehicle one final time. The movement was slow and deliberate, the same pattern of careful discipline that had guided his actions since the beginning. After a moment, he turned toward the barracks path and walked across the open yard. The lantern posts had begun to glow now, their soft yellow light appearing one by one as the sun slipped below the horizon. Reed passed the water container near the fence and paused briefly to refill the metal bucket resting beside the porch steps. The action was quiet and almost invisible, just another small task completed without attention. When he finished, he placed the bucket exactly where it had been the night before and stepped back from the porch. Aiko stood near the doorway, watching the gesture unfold. Reed glanced toward the barracks as he straightened, his eyes briefly meeting hers again through the growing evening light. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them remained the same respectful space that had existed since the beginning. Reed lifted his hand slightly in a small nod of recognition before turning away to continue his patrol across the compound. Aiko remained where she stood, the warm evening air moving gently around the porch as the lantern light flickered across the ground. In the quiet that followed, she felt something settle inside her thoughts with unexpected clarity. All day she had watched the Americans move through their work without anger, without humiliation, without any desire to remind the prisoners of their defeat. They simply followed a discipline that seemed as natural to them as breathing. The invisible line they kept between themselves and the prisoners was not weakness. It was control, real control, the kind that did not need to prove itself through force. Aiko looked out across the camp as the sky deepened into a dark blue filled with the first stars of evening. The place that had once seemed like the edge of an unknown threat now appeared almost peaceful under the lantern light. And for the first time since leaving home, she allowed herself to consider a possibility that would have seemed impossible only days before. Perhaps the most powerful lesson of the war was not how enemies fought each other. Perhaps it was how some people chose not to. The night settled fully over the camp and the lanterns along the paths glowed softly against the darkness, their warm yellow lights spreading in quiet circles across the dusty ground. The temperature had fallen to the low 70s now, and the breeze moving through the palm trees beyond the fence carried the distant sound of insects beginning their evening chorus. Aiko Tanaka remained standing near the barracks porch long after most of the other women had returned inside. The day had been longer than any she could remember, not because of hardship, but because every hour had quietly dismantled something she once believed without question. She rested her hands against the wooden railing and looked across the compound where the last movements of the soldiers were fading into the calm rhythm of night patrols. A lantern swayed slightly near the supply shed. A truck door closed somewhere near the motor pool. Footsteps passed along the gravel path as guards continued their steady rounds along the fence line. Nothing in the scene suggested triumph or humiliation. It simply looked like a place where people had accepted responsibility for order and chosen to maintain it without cruelty. Aiko thought about the moment the truck door had opened the previous day, about the way she had braced herself for something terrible to happen the instant she stepped down onto the dirt. She remembered the way her body had prepared for rough hands pulling her forward, the way every warning she had heard echoed in her mind. Yet the moment never came. No one had grabbed her. No one had forced her forward. The Americans had simply stepped back and pointed the way. That small absence had been the first crack in the wall of certainty she had carried across the ocean. Since then the cracks had spread quietly through every hour of the day. The water bucket placed beside the porch during the night. The breakfast crate left without supervision. the shared work that required trust instead of force. The calm nod exchanged across the yard. Each gesture had been small on its own, almost too ordinary to notice. But together they formed something far stronger than the fear she had expected to face. They formed proof that restraint could exist even in the presence of power. Across the yard, a familiar figure crossed the lantern light once more. Thomas Reed moved along the fence line during his patrol, his silhouette briefly outlined by the glow of the nearest post. He paused to check the gate latch, just as Iko had seen him do the night before, then continued down the path with the same steady pace. He did not look toward the barracks again. The routine of the camp had already carried him forward to the next task. Iko watched until his figure disappeared into the darker edge of the compound. Then she lifted her eyes toward the sky above the palm trees. The stars were brighter now, scattered across the deep blue like quiet points of light. Somewhere beyond that sky lay the country she had left behind, the story she had grown up believing about the enemies across the ocean. Those stories had once felt solid, impossible to question. Yet standing here now, surrounded by the calm order of the camp, she understood that the most powerful moment of the entire day had not been an act of kindness or generosity. It had been the moment when nothing happened at all. The moment when the soldiers who held complete authority simply chose not to cross a line that would have been easy to cross. Iko slowly turned back toward the barracks door, the lantern light brushing softly across the wooden steps as she moved inside. Behind her, the camp continued its quiet rhythm beneath the stars, steady and disciplined, a place where power existed without cruelty and where a single day had quietly rewritten everything she thought she knew about the people she once feared.